Brethren, by saying thank you. It's been a really good week. At least it has for me. I hope y'all have received something from it. But I've enjoyed being here. Y'all have spoiled me rotten. I kind of loathe getting on my scales in the morning because y'all have fed me and fed me and fed me. And then they took me to an all-you-can-eat place yesterday. And I told myself I am not going to get any extras at all. But if y'all have not gone over to Miss Donna's, y'all have missed out. And I can't resist everything but temptation. So they may be small, those shrimp, but you eat enough of them, they'll fill you up. You know, it's been a great week, and I appreciate so much the time here with you. Brethren, the older I get, the more I appreciate the value of time spent together. You know, when you stop and ponder life, we will never be here again like this. You know, some will move away, and some will fall away, and some will pass away. And every year, these events you get together with over the times, and you, well, where's so-and-so? Well, they passed away. Where's so-and-so? Well, they moved somewhere else. This is how life happens. And I think when you appreciate that on the front side of events, it makes it more special. You can slow down and try to enjoy what you're involved in. The song we just sang, the idea of leaning on the everlasting arms of God. The idea that we can always count on God, and you can. We've journeyed through quite a bit of the Bible this week together, and that lesson is reiterated over and over and over again. The way that God, whether it's with faithful women, faithful men, even unfaithful people, God's always saying, you can count on God to be God. You can count on God to stand in His place. You can count on God to do what He says. You can't say that about anybody else. All the rest of us have the capacity, at least, for failure, and God doesn't. If you grabbed your flyer or you saw the printout this last week, you know tonight's lesson is entitled, Don't Despise the Day of Small Things. That comes from the book of Zechariah, chapter 4 and verse 10. The people had gone back, and they were Zerubbabel and Ezra and Nehemiah, and they're in the process of rebuilding the temple. And Haggai was sent, we talked about that some on Sunday, to tell them to get back after the work. And there in Zechariah 4 and Ezra 3, I should say, verses 10 through 13, we see a scene where they have relaid the foundation. And it's kind of you can see this. I'm going to show it to you in the church here in a second. They lay the foundation of the temple. And the kids, the youngsters, these are the ones who have returned now from captivity. Now, don't get in your mind that during the captivity, everybody went back. Only about 50,000 did. But they go back to Jerusalem, and they're working on the temple. And they get that foundation poured, and the young people, that'd be anybody under 70, the ones that hadn't seen the first temple, when they see it, they are excited, and they're praising God, and they're singing, and they're joyous. But then you have the ancient people, that's folks like Larry's age and older, the older folks who had seen the first temple, and were told as they looked at it, they began to cry and say, this is not what it looked like. This is not nearly as big and grand as when Solomon built it. So you have mass confusion. Half the people, the younger folks, are all excited. We're praising God. The foundation is laid, and worship is coming back to Jerusalem, which, by the way, should have been the right attitude. But the older folks it's not like it used to be. I want to talk to you older ones for a second. The rest of y'all can just listen. Be careful with the good old day mindset. Well, the church I grew up in was so much better than how things are now. Things today are really messed up compared to what they used to be. Can you put yourself for a second in the mind of young people? Brethren, if we're not careful, we will jerk the heart right out of their chest. We will quench the spirit right out of them. We will beat out of them any hope, any idea that there are good days ahead, that things can work out, that God's in control, and that the church is okay. Do not ever diminish the value of God and being one of God's people. God was still God, and things were still okay when only 8 people got in that boat. Yes or no? Yes. God was still God when the entire world's population sinned at the same time and was driven from the garden. Was He not? Yes. And by the way, He gave us the first prophetic passage about the coming of the Christ as hope when it came to get rid of sin. The only place that any human being is ever in a condition where there's no hope is when they die and are lost. Otherwise, we're fine. We're in the presence of God. We're in the place of God. We have the providence of God. We've got the Word of God. Is that not true? Is God not in control? If that's the case, why should we ever be really despondent? That's easy to say, Michael, if things really, they're not as good as they used to be. Let's analyze that for a second. I'll do the short version. I have two ways I do this. One, I'll do the entire history of the world. I'll do this one just with America. So when was this golden era that everybody was religious and everybody was holy and everything was good? Go back to the days of the early pilgrims, the early settlers, if you will, as far as the Western European experience is concerned. How easy was that trip across the Atlantic? How easy were the conditions when you got here? How many times, how many colonies were just gone? They exist no more. They all died. Then you finally scratch a foothold out, and you get the 13 colony situation taking place, and you've got political upheaval. We had troubles now, don't we? We're not shooting other Americans in the street. We're not having tea parties in Boston. We're not revolting against and burning down and shooting the king's men. The Revolutionary War, that was a time of a lot of trauma and a lot of difficulties. And then you get past that, you talk about inflation, go read your American history. When the country started in 1787, about the first 10 or 12 years there, and the arguments back and forth about should we have a national bank or not, and should we try to control inflation or not, it was bad. Then you get into the 1812 time frame, the Brits decide to come back, take it again, and that doesn't happen. We have another war. Then you go into the westward expansion. And back then, so we're driving across this country, setting up cities, setting up the fort system, fighting the Indians, as we were called, Native American, I don't care what you call them. And by the way, I don't care which side of this line you're on. If you're a Native American, that wasn't a real good time. If you're an advancing settler, that wasn't a real good time. And everything killed you. Malaria killed you. Typhoid killed you. Your horse killed you. A head cold killed you. You know how many folks died of consumption? You know what that is? When they don't know what it was that killed you. You just died. Childbirth killed you. Average age of death for a man's about 44, a woman's about 30. Now, again, I'm trying to find this beautiful time and everything was just rosy all the time. Then you slide into the peaceful years of the 1860s. Oh, wait a minute. That's when we had the Civil War, as the Yankees called it, the War of Northern Aggression, as the Southerners called it. But nonetheless, that falls out. 800,000 people dead or maimed in that war. 1 million people. All Americans, both sides of it. Then you have the time frame of the carpetbaggers. Then you roll into the early portion of the first century, of the 20th century, and World War I breaks out. You have the trench warfare. You got men that ride out on horses with swords in their hand against dug-in machine gun nests. 6 million French soldiers died alone in that war. Horrible war. By the way, the Spanish flu hits in 1918, wipes out millions of people. Then you slide into the roaring 20s, where you have all that alcohol, and you have all the mob violence, and you have Al Capone doing his thing. Then we kind of come through that when the Great Depression hits. And during the Great Depression, you've got the Dust Bowl that blows through what you and I know as Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska. So all those folks are driven off. And you have the great migration of those starving farmers. You know, the book that y'all read when you were younger, the Grapes of Wrath and so forth. Or the movie that you watched if you didn't read the book. But nonetheless, it was a horrible time as well. But thankfully, that German named Hitler came along and pulled the world out of the Great Depression. That's a hard way to do it, though, wasn't it? Massive World War II. Hundreds of thousands of American deaths. Millions worldwide. You've got the war in Europe. You've got Pearl Harbor. You've got the bombing in Nagasaki and Hiroshima. Then you go to the Cold War. Many of y'all were there for this. Some of your moms and dads were there for the Korean War, followed by the Vietnam War, which some of y'all yourself experienced. I kind of came along during that one as a kid. Then we have the great economy of Jimmy Carter. Nice man from Georgia, but didn't have a whole lot of sense when it came to the economy. Talk about inflation. We had some inflation. I recall that as a little guy in the late 70s. Reagan comes along, things get a little bit better, but you still get the pressure there with Russia, the Cold War's going on. Finally, at that ends, the East German Wall falls. Now we step into Clinton and Bush and Obama and Trump and Biden, and now here we are. Now, where did I miss it, brethren? Where did I miss that 50 years or 100 years of peace and prosperity and no troubles, and the church was just hunky-dory and everything was fine? We have a way of looking back in the past, and we lionize. We remember the good, and we forget the bad. Don't ever forget God. Life with God is good. The rest of it are just the externals. And sometimes we get discouraged. And we get to looking at the world through the eyes of flesh, and we're not real sure how it's going to work out. Don't despise the days of little things. That was the prophet's message. When they saw that temple, they were thinking, oh, it's not very big. Forget it's not very big. Worship is coming back to Jerusalem. The temple is going to be reestablished. The city walls will be built. The glory of Jerusalem and the Jewish people will rise again in that time frame and stay there to the coming of Christ. Things are not always as they seem. I want to give you a few examples of where God took something that looked very insignificant and did something great with it. My first example comes from Exodus chapter 3. God calls Moses. Moses had been, and there's the whole story of Moses warrants preaching many, many times over the course of a preacher's lifetime. Certainly, I think a time or two a year, great character. But God protects him as a baby. He's raised in the house of Pharaoh. Great irony there. The Pharaoh that was worried about the Jewish people destroying his empire raised the very man that did in his own house. That's the hand of God, brethren. You see the hand of God in the glove of history all the way through the Bible. That's an example of it. But he tries to deliver his people, kills a guy in the process, has to run off. He thinks that window has closed. He's gone for 40 years, living in the land of Midian. Marries a woman there, raises a couple of sons. 80 years old, he's about ready to retire, as we might say. And then God shows up. God has a way of doing that, doesn't he? Sometimes, and you can have a sermon. I got one called the GOPs in the Bible. Grand old people. God has a lot of grand old people that he picks late in life and does great things with. Now, there's a couple of y'all in this crowd here. Just because you have some gray in your head doesn't mean you're through yet. You still got some things to do. That's what he's going to do here with Moses. But I want to focus on what Moses has. When God tells Moses, go back down there and deliver my people. Not kind of like the way it starts out. He appears to Moses and tells him, I'm going to free my people from bondage. If I'm Moses, I would be thinking, that's good. Yes, amen. Go get them. And you're going to do it. Hey, now, wait a minute. It's like that song we sing. Here am I, send me. You ever lied when you sung it? Here am I, send brother so-and-so. Here am I, send sister so-and-so. But nonetheless, God says you're going to do it. He says, I can't do it. And finally, God gets a belly full. Listen, anytime God tells me to do something, and I convince myself I cannot. You understand, I'm telling God he lied. I am saying, God, you are wrong. Those words can't be in the same sentence, brethren. God, by his very nature, cannot be wrong. If I ever find myself in conflict with God, I know who's conflicted. It's not God. And God finally says, Moses, oh man, what's in your hand? Stick. Throw it down. Throws it down. Becomes a serpent. Moses runs backwards. Moses isn't a little girly girl guy. He runs back. There had to be a poisonous snake. He was a man of the desert. He knew he's looking at something there that can bite you. And God says, go pick it back up by the tail. He picks it up. It goes back into a stick. God takes an 80-year-old man and a stick, and he brings Pharaoh, the strongest king of the strongest empire on the earth, to his knees with that. He brings the entire nation down. God didn't need an army. He didn't need a Hercules-type character. He didn't need magic weapons. He took an 80-year-old man who made every excuse he could. I can't talk. They won't believe me. How am I going to make them believe me? Because God gave him signs to prove that he was God's man. He took that one old man and that stick, and before it was all said and done, he would touch the Nile River, turn it to blood. He would do all the plagues of about 2.5 years. As I watched the story of Pharaoh unfold, I am thoroughly convinced there's not a man that's ever drawn breath on this earth who had more personal, one-on-one instructions from God than Pharaoh. Never so lived a man that had no excuse for rejecting God. God gave him 3 small miracles and 10 big ones. Put those in quotes, right? The miracle of the staff, the miracle of the leprous hand, the miracle of pouring the water out to turn to blood. Then he goes to the 10 plagues. And every time God preached to him through Moses about what would happen. But as you go through that, God told him. Whenever first God sends Moses, he didn't ask Pharaoh to go. God told him to go. Let my people go. He didn't ask, he told him, let my people go. Pharaoh did not being told. God doesn't care if you don't like being told or not. He's God and you're not. We get that reversed sometimes. God is God, was God and is God, will be God long after I'm on this earth and gone. God is in no way diminished whether you or I serve him or not. I think sometimes we get so full of ourselves that somehow, well, God's lucky to have me. That concept should never float around your head. But that's how men treat it. I'll go to church there if y'all may give me this concession, this concession, this concession. Who do we think we are? This is God. God says, let my people go. Who is the Lord that I should hear his voice? That's his response. Man, I want to back up and hide behind a rock just saying that to you now. Who is God that I should hear his voice? And God tells Moses, you tell him, before this is over, he will know who I am and that there are no other gods in Egypt. And he works those 10 plagues. Every single plague destroys a corresponding Egyptian god. God shows him who he was. My point is that little is much if God be with it. An old man with a stick was more than sufficient to bring down the armies and the culture and the wealth and the power of Egypt in the days of Moses. Think about David. Whenever you have David and Goliath's story set forth for us there in the book of 1 Samuel, he goes to see his brothers, and while he's there, this giant comes out and throws down a challenge to the people. Now, Goliath's somewhere between 9 and 10 feet tall. He's a big guy. Now, David's not a little bitty kid, but he's between hay and grass. He's not a full-blown in the army fighting soldier yet either. He's got 3 brothers that are, but he's not. And while he's there, this giant walks out there. And for 40 days, he'd come out there, and he threw this challenge out there. He basically says, send me a man. We'll fight. If I kill him, y'all become our servants, the Philistines. If he kills me, we'll be your servants. Of that great Jewish army, no one would go out there and fight Goliath. King Saul's not a little guy. King Saul, as you recall, stood head and shoulders above everyone else. King Saul had already won multiple battles. King Saul never lost a battle till the one he died late in his life. He was an undefeated conquering king as well. He wouldn't go. David's oldest brother, Eliab. Now listen, Samuel's no lightweight. When God told Samuel that he was taking the kingdom away from Saul, he said, you go to Jesse's house, and we're going to appoint from one of his sons my new king. Because he has a son that has a heart like me, a man after my own heart. He gets there, and Jesse lines those boys up, oldest to youngest, and that oldest one is Eliab. And when Samuel sees him, he says, surely this is the king of God. This is a big old guy. I used to say it must be like Arnold Schwarzenegger. These kids don't know who that's an old man in their world. So Dwayne Johnson. Okay, this is the rock. This is the guy. And David tells Samuel, this goes back to my lesson. Samuel, I am Jehovah. I don't see as men see. Men look upon the outward appearance. I look on the heart. In other words, it's not the size of the dog in the fight. It's the size of the fight in the dog. Eliab's not the one. Jesse's got one, but it's the young one. It's the little guy. He ain't a baby, but the youngest son. It's David. He's the one that will stand the tallest. He's the one that will lead my men. He's the one that will always stay true to me. So David winds up here at the battle. And when the Philistine says that, he is angered. His spirit is stirred. My personal opinion, if King Saul would have walked out there and fought against Goliath, he would have killed Goliath. If Eliab would have gone out there, he would have killed Goliath. Any one of them could have gone out there and killed Goliath. God was not with Goliath. If God is not with them, it doesn't matter how big they are. It never has. I'll go back to the flood. Millions on the outside, a handful on the inside. Who's God with? The inside. Never has mattered to God. He's not on my list, but he could be there. Remember Jonathan, the son of Saul? There's an event where Jonathan and his armor bearer, there's 20 guys over there. And he says, hey, you see those 20 guys? He basically says, let's go jump them. But we'll test it first. We'll holler at them and say, hey, guys, y'all want to mix it up? Y'all want to fight? If those 20 guys say, yeah, come fight us, we'll take that as a sign that God wants us to fight them. Now, if they say, no, leave us alone, we'll decide God doesn't want us to. I think I'd have reversed that. But anyway, because the odds being what they were, they say, yeah, come over here and we'll show you a thing or two. They went over there, but Jonathan told his armor bearer, if God be with us, God is able to deliver with many or with few. I told you this on Sunday. I'm going to throw a verse with it to you again right now. Psalm 119, verse 160. The sum, S-U-M, of thy word is truth. I know a lot of people who know some of the Bible, S-O-M-E, but they don't know the sum of it, S-U-M-E, S-U-M. That's what that passage is saying. Friends, listen to me. If you don't know the sum, the total ebb and flow of the Bible, you don't know God's truth. The sum. God has put this here. He's put lesson after lesson after lesson after lesson in there because me and you sometimes we're scared. Me and you sometimes we're hard-headed. Me and you sometimes we look for an excuse to hide behind. He is showing you over and over and over, it doesn't matter what it looks like. The reality is, if I'm with you, you cannot be defeated. The reality is, if I'm not with you, you cannot win. You understand that? Sometimes you'll hear people say, well, we got to be careful. If we don't do this, it's going to make so-and-so mad. If so-and-so leaves God, that's between them and God, not me and them. We stand with God. David hears that man cry out. I could go into more detail in the story. I'm not going to. We'll just fast forward to the very end of it. He takes 5 smooth stones. When he goes out to kill a 10-foot tall man, he doesn't ask for Excalibur, the magical sword of King Arthur. He doesn't ask for some weapon of Perseus, the Greek mythology. He doesn't ask God to give him something fancy to fight with. He took a handful of rocks. Somebody says, how come he took 5? Bible doesn't say, but I do know this. I know that Goliath had 4 brothers that were also giants. And I know before David quit this earth, he killed all 4 of them, he or his men. I don't know if he thought when I killed that one, I had to kill the rest of them, whatever, but he went out there. I don't know because he told Saul, I've already killed a bear. I've already killed a lion. This Philistine dog will be just like them. You see how he saw him? He didn't see a 10-foot tall giant. He saw a dog. He saw an uncircumcised Philistine who was cursing God. He saw an enemy of God. He saw a man to be silenced and destroyed, and he did. When you read that context, it says, and he ran, verses 18 to 19, 1 Samuel 17. He ran toward Goliath. And he swung the stone, and he hit the giant head, and it sunk in his forehead. And he fell down on his face. Not a very dignified death for a mighty warrior. Then he ran up there, pulled Goliath's sword from his side. He didn't have a sword. Cut Goliath's head off with his own sword, and then he held the man's head up. And when the Jews saw Goliath was dead, then they attacked. That's another lesson. Don't stand around behind people waiting on someone else. When he stood up and did his duty, he inspired the rest to attack. Somebody's got to go first. Somebody has to stand up first. Somebody has to speak up first. David did. And because of that, all the folks were emboldened and they charged. And a great victory overcame. You know why David succeeded when others didn't? He had courage. I heard a story one time about this young man. He kind of grew up in the church and went off to college. And when he got to college, some of these evolutionary type teachers and philosophers got a hold of him, and he lost his faith. He came back kind of as an agnostic, and he came back to church, and he was sitting in the foyer. And as the kids were coming out of Bible class, he was asking them questions about what they studied. This one little girl came out. She's probably 9 or 10 years old, I guess. And he asked her, he said, hey, little girl, what did you study about today? She said, Jonah and the great fish. Well, what would you say if I told you that I went off to college and I have learned there's not a fish in the ocean that has a throat with a wide enough circumference to swallow the head of a man? What would you say? I said, well, I'd say the Bible said God prepared a fish and the fish swallowed Jonah. Well, you're not ever going to know, though, are you, little girl? She said, yes, I will. Well, how are you going to know? She said, when I get to heaven, I'll just ask Jonah. And the smart student said, well, what if Jonah's not in heaven? She said, then you can ask him. The point is, she had enough courage to say something back to the man trying to diminish and destroy the truth. David he possessed the one trait that escaped King Saul. He possessed the one trait that escaped those other ones, and it was courage in God. David was not nearly as impressed with the size of the giant before him as he was the size of the God behind him. Brother, that's us. I don't care how large or small the numbers are of the Lord's church. I don't care what the culture thinks about the Lord's church. Given the corruption of our culture, I'd remind you of what Christ told his own apostles and disciples. Beware when all men speak well of you, for so spake they of the false prophets which were before you. Sometimes a mark of faithfulness is seen in your enemies. David was a great example of, though he was a young man without a lot of war experience, and though he was a man with what we'd call a fairly rudimentary weapon, he was a man that had more than enough to get the job done. It didn't take a whole lot to kill a giant who was opposing God, did it? The next one that comes to my mind is that little maid, little slave girl in the house of Naaman in 2 Kings chapter 5. Talk about speaking up and doing what you can. This girl had been taken by the Assyrian king, or the Assyrian general, in service of a Syrian king. But this Naaman has leprosy real bad. So he's there, and he's, of course, not in good physical shape. And while she's in his house, she tells his wife, her mistress, there's a prophet back in my land, back in Jerusalem, in Israel, who can cure people of leprosy. So Naaman gets that word. Here's the person who points someone to Jesus. A good study sometime for you would be the Apostle Andrew. I don't know very much about Andrew at all. But I know one, because the Bible doesn't give us a whole lot of stuff about Andrew. But I know one of the two times he's mentioned, I know besides the list, I know one thing that Andrew did that made a lasting mark on the church. You know what it was? Andrew brought his brother, Peter, to Jesus. And Peter made a mark. Sometimes the greatest thing we can do is just to get somebody to the church. Just to get them to study. You may not be the best Bible material teacher in this room, but you may have a very wonderful, engaging, disarming personality where people trust you and you can get them to come with you to sit through a study with a preacher or an elder or someone else in the church who can teach them. It's a big thing, a big deal. This little girl points Naaman toward the prophet. Now, this story gets interesting because he goes to the prophet. There's kind of two of these. So this small girl, not anything, no one significant other than what she tells him. He goes to Elisha, and Elisha, by the way, doesn't even come out to see him. I kind of wonder as I watch Naaman's attitude, and here's how we are sometimes. Naaman had a bunch of preconceived ideas as to how this was going to go. But Elisha doesn't even come outside. He sends his servant out there, and he says, you tell Naaman to go down to the Jordan River and dip 7 times, and the leprosy will be cured. And he starts getting mad. He knows the same thing you and I know. River water doesn't cure leprosy. He's had a bath before. He may have crossed the Jordan when he came over to whip the Jews the first time and take all those slaves. What do you mean go dip in the Jordan? I don't see what getting wet's going to do when it comes to my salvation. Never heard that or something close to it. Water doesn't clean that kind of stuff. And there are prettier rivers back home. I could have stayed back home in the river Parfar and Havana. Those rivers are prettier. I could have dipped there around Damascus and saved myself a trip. So he's just fuming, and he's just cussing, and he's just storming off, and he's just leaving. I don't know if he's cussing with curse words, but he's fussing about it. And one of his servants says, Master, by the way, he also still had leprosy. He was told by the man of God what to do to get rid of leprosy. When he gets God's answer as to how to get rid of leprosy, he rejects God's answer. Guess what? His problem remains. It doesn't go away. You cannot ignore God into salvation. You cannot ignore God into a life of blessing. You cannot ignore God and get to heaven. Now, I know that seems pretty obvious, but brethren, we fight that battle every single time we have a conversation with every non-Christian on the earth. 99 out of 100 will argue with what God says you must do to become a Christian. Now, you're lost. You got leprosy. By the way, leprosy is often used as a anti-type of sin. You can't cure it yourself. God can cure it. And yet people today still reject the plan. Finally, he says, Naaman, if that prophet would have required some great thing, some great sum of money, some great physical feat, you would have gladly done it. He says, yeah, but I thought he'd come out and he'd strike the boil and say something over it and it'd go away. Well, who cares? Behold, I thought the gates of hell would be kicked in by people who got there because they thought something else. Jeremiah 10, verse 23, Lord, I know it is not in man that walks to direct his own steps. Jeremiah 6, verse 16, seek the old paths. Where is the good way? And walk therein, and you shall find rest unto your soul. But they said, we will not walk therein. That's our problem. Our kind of thinking is what got us into this mess to start with. Only by following God's instructions can we get out. You know the story. He finally repents, changes his direction, goes back down there, dips one time, he still got it. Dips 2 times, he still got it. 3, 4, 5, 6. But number 7, when it goes down, it comes back up. When he obeyed completely what God said you must do to get rid of leprosy, guess what? He got rid of leprosy. And for the life of me, I see no reason at all for 2 Kings chapter 5 to even be in the Bible, except as an undeniable parallel to what happens in the plan of salvation when you're baptized for the remission of sins. When you come to God in sin, and we're all there, Romans 3 and verse 23, and God tells you what you must do to be saved, you got to believe in the Christ, John 8:32. You've got to repent of your past sins, Luke 13 verse 3, confess your faith in him with your mouth, Romans 10:10, and be baptized in water for the remission of your sins, Acts 2:38. Until you do that. I don't see what baptism has to do with it. You know what? It has no more to do with it than dunking in the Jordan River 7 times had to do with leprosy. But just as it was the power of God, it was God's power, and on God's side of things, to wash that man from his leprosy, it is God and he alone who has been sinned against and who has the power to forgive sin. And if God ties our forgiveness to the water, then to the water you must go. I'll give you another very quick illustration of that same thing. The Passover feast. Back to the plagues, the 10th plague. The oldest of every household, animal and people, are going to die that night. Unless, when you have the Passover feast, you eat the unleavened bread, you drink the unleavened wine, you have that lamb of the first year without spot, without blemish, cooked a certain way, eaten a certain way, and the blood of that lamb is to be taken and smeared on the doorpost and on the crosspiece, the mantle of the doorway. Question. You hear that? You believe that? You cook the flatbread. You fix the unleavened wine, grape juice. You cook that sheep. You collect that blood in a bowl, and you leave it sitting there on the ground. If that blood was not applied to that doorway, what would happen to your family? The oldest in the family would die. Until you go to where God said he put the blood, your sin remains. Acts 22 and verse 16, I can show you the Apostle Paul before he's converted. To Saul, he had seen Jesus, he had talked to Jesus, he had confessed to Jesus, he had fasted 3 days with no food or water. He's penitent, but he's told there, and now why tarriest thou? Arise and be baptized to wash away your sins. They were still there. Little things, not little for Naaman now. He's pure of his leprosy. How about Samson and that jawbone of that donkey? Think about this for a second. Samson's a great story. There's so many lessons there. Found there in the middle of Judges 13 through about Judges 18. But there about chapter 15, he had the event before where he had already been cheated out of those 30 changes of garments, and he'd had that gambling situation he had gotten through. He goes back to go get his wife. Her father had already given her somebody else because he thought that he was offended by her. So he tries to give him another daughter. He doesn't want that. He says, I tell you what, since the Philistines messed with me, and they're the ones that conjured all this trouble, that caused me to lose my wife, he catches 300 foxes. I'd like to have seen this, by the way. puts them tail to tail, puts torches on them, lights the torches, and turns them loose. And it's fall. It's when the crops, you also seen wheat whenever it's kind of nice and brown and flammable, and he burns all the crops. Now that has a huge financial impact, also a huge hunger impact. When it causes a famine, that's a big deal. Philistines get mad. They send an army down there after him. But first they send a group of men, and he kills all them. He goes to the top of the rock of Edom, and he kills them. It just says he smote them hip and thigh. Killed a big old bunch of them. Goes back to a different hill there in Jerusalem. They send 3,000 soldiers the next time the Philistines do to the Jews and say, what are y'all here? What are you invading for? We're coming for Samson. They go up there to him at Rimnah, say the army's come out to us. He says, I'll turn myself over to you if you don't kill me yourself, which I don't think they could have anyway, but that was what he tells them. They tie him up in two new widths of rope, take him down the hill. When he comes up to those 3,000 soldiers and Philistines, the Philistine army, they shout against him. He breaks the ropes, grabs the jawbone of a donkey, and kills 1,000 men. When God unleashed the strength of Samson, again, jawbone of a donkey. Now, I kind of wanted to, it's not in the Bible, curiosity point. You understand that God put that jawbone right there? Talk about providence. That donkey had died somewhere. Those coyotes and buzzards had scattered him around somewhere. But God had just exactly what Samson needed at the exact right place he needed it, at the exact right time that he needed it, so that when he put his hand out for a weapon was there. You see this right here? God has given us what we need. Romans 1 and verse 16, Paul says, for I am not ashamed of the gospel of Christ, for it is the power of God unto salvation. Hebrews 4 and verse 12 says it is quick. That word means alive. It is quick and active and sharper than any two-edged sword. Brethren, we have all we need. I don't care what the world throws at you. The answer to the question is in this book every time. God has not left us without witness. We've got the answers. So the question remains, why sometimes are we so timid? Paul told Timothy, we have not been given a spirit of fear and timidity, but rather one of power. Back to Samson, when those Jews came to get him about those Philistines, they told him, they said, don't you know you not, that they have dominion over us and rule over us? They didn't rule over Samson. Brethren, we bow before God, and there the list ends. We should not care what any government official thinks of us. I don't care what those 9 people wearing black robes on the Potomac think of us. I don't care what the presidents, vice presidents, incumbent, or coming in there. I don't care, because our doctrine has been taught by Christ. We are citizens of a different kingdom. We march to a different set of orders. We're not rebellious against the government, Romans 13, but we are primarily committed to God in spite of the government, Acts chapter 5. Samson's a great example. I've got 7 more. I'm just going to give you one more. Yeah, I could do this for 2 days. You know why? Because God did. God left us without excuse. You know, Romans chapter 1, God talks about how the world is designed in such a way that mankind is without excuse. We as Christians are certainly without excuse. Oh, I don't know what to do. What do you mean you don't know what to do? God's been showing you what to do every day of your life since you were old enough to hear the stories that your mama read you in the bed when you were growing up. This is us. These are our people. This is our heritage. This is our example. This is who we are. This is what we stand for and who we stand with. This is the attitude. This is the heartbeat of what we are and who we are. When God said, I am the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, put your name in there too, Gary and Michael as well. All of us, same story, just a different epoch of time, same exact experience. How about Gideon? Now, there's some backstory here that's also interesting, which I won't go back into too much. But he was tested when God first came to him. His daddy was an idol worshiper. His first test was, you go to your daddy's city and you tear your daddy's idol down. And he did. He went at night and broke it up. By the way, then the city father said, who did this? I said, well, Gideon did. Well, let's go kill him. And I like what his dad said. I guess he really believed in Baal. He said, well, if Baal's offended, let Baal kill him. Right? He can't do the same thing Elijah did. Baal's supposed to be the big old God. If he wants to whoop up on Gideon, let him go do it. But then God tells Gideon, we're gonna whip these Ammonites, these Midianites. They're like the sand of the sea. This big army is coming. I want you to go in there and fight them. So he calls the people to go fight. By the way, Gideon Gideon had some attitude too. God first calls him. He's hiding. He's somewhere threshing wheat where you're not supposed to be threshing wheat, because the Midianites knew you had wheat. They came and stole it. Those guys took everything but the campfire. They came through. They were robbing them blind. So he's smuggling food. And the vision comes to him and says, hey, you're a great man. This is a great people. You're going to go overthrow God is with you. Go overthrow the Midianites. He says, if God is with us, why are we hiding like a bunch of outlaws? Hey, I don't see God around here very much. That's not a good attitude. But God's going to show him some things. He does a couple of tests with the fleece and the dew to kind of get his confidence up. God says, get your army. He calls his army. He has 32,000 people. Now, 32,000 is not a whole lot compared to what he has to go fight. God says, that's too many. Tell the ones that are scared to go home. Now, I see a row full of older boys right now. But from the time I was y'all's age till mine now, I still don't understand. 22,000 admitted they were scared and left. I might be scared, but I wouldn't want Bryce to know it. I ain't going home. How about you? But now, if all y'all said, hey, let's get out of here, then I might go with you. I don't know. But 22,000 actually said, I'm scared, and they ran home. So now he's down to just a handful. God says, no, you still got too many. Take them down there and get a drink of water. So they go down and get a drink of water. And 300 of them dip in there watching while they drink. He said, that's my guys right there. Yeah, God tells him why. The reason 32,000 was too many, it wasn't really a huge army, but there were enough of them that had they won, they would have taken credit. And even the 10,000, that's too many. You'll still take credit. 300, okay, now it's going to be miraculous deliverance. And then when we get ready to go fight, here's your weapons. Get you ready? I'm going to arm all three of y'all. Here's what you guys get. You get a torch and a clay pot and a trumpet. We ain't playing band here. We're going to go fight. And God gives them a torch under a clay pot and a trumpet. Then he tells Gideon to go divide your army. You know, not supposed to do that either when it comes to military tactics. God says divide your army, surround them at night. You know what happens. They surround them. They break the pots when God says to. The light appears. All that breaking sound sounds like a charging army. They blow their trumpets. You know, here comes the cavalry. They're charging from all directions. They jump up, grab their own swords, and they slay their own people. They slaughter themselves at night. And they're told they're scattered. A great victory is won. God didn't need an army of hundreds of thousands. God didn't need supernatural weapons. God needed 300 faithful men who would do what he said, the way he said, when he said, and with what he said. Brethren, we have right here all that we need. God has given us the gospel. The dunamis, the power of God is the word of God. What we need is to trust what he has given us. What we need is to use what he has given us. What we need is courage to imitate their attitude and the way they did it. I need to learn this word better. If there's ever any fault or flaw in a conversion attempt when it comes to the word of God, it will fall on us not being prepared with it. But the gospel will always show us what to do. Brethren, Moses with that stick was enough. David with that handful of rocks was enough. That little girl pointing him toward the man of God and then him obeying what God's man told him for Naaman was enough. Gideon's 300 was enough. When Christ asked the apostles once, how much food do we have? Well, we got 5 loaves and 2 fish. And Christ blesses it. And they passed it out and feed 5,000 men plus women and kids. And they took up 12 baskets more. Listen, little is much if God be with it. Friends, we don't need more of us. We need more from each of us in God's service. If I will trust his word, if I will love his word, if I will learn his word, if I will teach his word, I will then have the right attitude, give off the right truth, have the right kind of confidence. I don't mean arrogance. We're not talking about pompous arrogance. We're talking about confidence in knowing that God has always won. I'll get back to I'll close with this one. We use this very first Bible class. Daniel 3 and verse 16. The three young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, O King Nebuchadnezzar, we're not careful to answer you upon this matter, for we serve a God who can deliver us from the fiery furnace. Here's my attitude. But whether he does or whether he doesn't, we will not bow. Brethren, whether the church grows and explodes numerically, and we get to where there's more members of the church in this country than not, or if we go the way of the dark ages again in the future, it does not matter. Stand with God, stand with truth. You do your duty during your time, and God is pleased. And all who appreciate that kind of attitude and that kind of moral standard will come to your side and will hold your hands up in that. But whatever we do, do not complain about, well, it used to be, but stop. Just stop. It doesn't matter what used to be. Even if it was, it doesn't matter. Today is what is. You and I are who are here. And it is our job and our privilege. We should thank God every night in our prayers. Thank you for counting us worthy to live at such a time as this. Because when the night is darkest, those points of light that do exist shine the brightest. May we shine like we teach our little kids. This little light of mine, what are you going to do with yours? Let it shine. It's together we stand and as we sing.